Hi, it's Mark Bossert from Top Local Lead Generation. We're here with Home Inspector David Fairbairn of Fairbairn Inspections in Vancouver. How are you doing today, Dave?
Hey, I'm good, Mark, and how are you?
I'm good. Great. So we're talking about safety issues in older homes in Vancouver, BC. Come on, there's no problems here in Vancouver, is there?
If there was no problems, guys like me would probably be unemployed by now. But luckily for us, there are a lot of issues, and it depends on the type of building you're buying. But with the older homes, there's a lot to look out for. So I'd be happy to go through those with you and just sort of tell you a bit about them.
Sure. So is there asbestos in older homes in Vancouver?
Yes, most of the time. And when I say older homes, we're kind of talking about houses that are pre-1950s. Those are your character homes, right? Those are your really, really old homes. But, to some people, an older home might be anything pre-1970s. And asbestos is actually not quite as sort of ancient as you think. You'll actually see it more recently in building life. In fact, you can actually find asbestos in homes up to 1996, which always surprises people. So, with the older homes, as soon as you go back before about 1970, you're going to see it in really obvious places. And when you get a quality home inspection, the inspector will go through and point out areas where you don't necessarily have to do anything about it, but you would want to know about it. For instance, I don't know if you've ever gone into, maybe a Vancouver special and taken a look at the furnace duct work, right? For your heating system, and you've got this sort of white plaster tape on there. It almost looks like, when you break your arm and you get a cast, right? So you got this wrapped around all your joints. Most of that material, we're probably talking in a range of about 95 to 98% of it has asbestos fibers in the actual tape. So that's one of them, in furnace glues. And then we're also going to see it in a few other areas, especially in older homes. Attics are a big one. If you go to an older home, I was in one from about 1941, 1942 the other day, and the attic had what's called vermiculite insulation, and it kind of looks like almost like a silver popcorn. I sort of describe it as that sort of light and fluffy, and but it's actually like almost like a mineral. Very hard to explain unless you've actually felt it, but that material, most of it does contain asbestos as well. And then there's some other ones that aren't really as obvious, sometimes with your flooring tiles, or even if you go to a finished-in basement, the ceiling tiles can actually have asbestos in them. And what I like to do is basically tell the client, you're buying into a house that's quite old. There's a good chance you've got asbestos here and here, but as long as you don't disturb it, this may not be a safety hazard for you. As long as, but if you're going to go in there and you're going to gut the whole place and reno the entire house, then you're definitely going to want to get this stuff tested. So that's going to add to your expenses, because all of a sudden you've got to pay for disposal and having everybody wear respirators while they're working. And it's going to set up your costs. And it's also going to, there's the safety aspect as well for your family. So to answer your question, yeah, there's definitely asbestos in older homes. The inspector can, point it out to you where it's located.
Sure, and that's probably true right across North America.
That's true, yeah. It's very similar. You go to the States, some areas of the States where, they actually have, some really, really old homes. The oldest home I've ever inspected was 122 years old. Down in certain areas, New England, a lot of the houses are just, most of them are that old. So if you go down there, they have similar problems as well.
Yeah. So what about talking about old technology? What about knob and tube wiring? Do we have that in Vancouver?
Yeah, we got a ton of knob and tube wiring. There's a lot of knob and tube. I know your house was built in 2006, so you are not really at risk for that problem. You've got what's called Lumex wiring, which is your standard new construction wiring that we've been using since about the 50s or 60s. And knob and tube wiring was a very early version of electrical wiring, where they actually sent the wire along and they hung it on a little ceramic knob on the side of the joist. Usually you can see it in the attic. And then when it goes through the joist, they drill a hole and they put a little tube. ceramic tube, and it goes through the tube, and it's just a network of knobs and tubes, and you can probably guess where the name comes from, knob and tube. And the problem with that is that it can, the jacketing on it can actually fall apart, and then you've got exposed conductors, which pose not only a shock hazard but also a fire hazard, especially in older attics where they buried the knob and tube in the insulation. So this is a big one. If I were to tally up all the major issues I've ever found in older homes, knob and tube would probably be the number one issue that's a real sticking point because the insurance companies don't like it. And if you do find knob and tube, you have to get somebody who's a qualified electrician or a qualified electrical inspector to come out and basically sign off saying, okay, it's either safe or it's not safe and you have to do this much work to make it safe again. So older homes, definitely knob and tube, probably one of the top concerns that home buyers have.
All right. So when you mentioned like insurance doesn't like it, as in you probably are not going to get house insurance.
There's a pretty good chance that could happen. In some cases, they will actually grandfather you in. Let's say somebody's been living there for 10 years and they had somebody sign off saying it was safe. There's a pretty good chance that you might be able to go get insurance from the same company and say, hey, I'd like to move in here, and they'll maybe do it for you. But there's no guarantees. And insurance companies are in the business of making sure that they don't pay out on a huge fire or a flood, and rightfully so. So these are the kind of things that I warn the clients about, and then I say, okay, get somebody to check it out before you proceed with the purchase. And once in a while they'll say, okay, the electrician actually said we've got to rewire the top floor, and it's going to cost $8,000 or $10,000. So yeah, definitely something that you're going to want to find out if you're buying pre-1950. This is probably one of the most important things, and I'll talk about some of the other issues later, but this is probably one of the single most important you can look out for.
All right, so again, another kind of old technology that is banned at this point. What about lead paint?
Lead paint, yeah, huge one. We see lead paint pre-1978. Obviously, if you're going into a house that has been painted a number of times, and you still got the original plaster, or the original drywall, or what have you, there's a pretty good chance if you scrape away the layers of paint, you're going to come across some old lead paint. And that was just a fact of life back then, is that the paint, some of it was leaded. And the big thing to know about lead paint, and I always tell a customer this, is that unless you are destroying it in some way or removing it in some way, it's really not a serious hazard, because it's buried usually behind other layers of paint, or you may have wallpaper on top of it, or it may just be sitting there and not doing anything. If you start removing the paint, steaming the wallpaper off, things like that, you're definitely going to want to test for lead paint. You can actually get a lead paint test kit. I think Home Depot sells one right now, and you can actually just do a test right there in your own home. So yeah, definitely very common. Probably in terms of it being a huge safety concern, probably not top on the list, but definitely something that I get asked a lot about, and I always try to let them know that there probably is something here if it's a certain age.
Yeah, so these last three really are big concerns if you're the fixer-upper or you're buying something that you're going to remodel a whole lot of stuff, because you're not necessarily going to, none of these are going to be obvious to you. That's
right, yeah, exactly. And if I'm a general contractor and I'm going to come in and you call me in to reno your kitchen, these things, I'm going to find them. First of all, if the home inspector didn't tell you, I'm going to find these things. I'm going to go in there and say, okay, well, actually, you've got asbestos on your ducts and in your walls, and we're going to test your plaster, and maybe your plaster has asbestos. So, the thing is to just know about it before you start planning. And if you have any concerns about it, there are a number of companies that will actually come up and do asbestos testing. You can actually get the air cleared in the home. They can actually test for asbestos fibers. And my company, we offer some basic testing services as well. So a lot of inspectors, they'll find vermiculite in the attic and they'll say, well, it might have asbestos. We do have the ability to take a sample and process it 24 hours later. You actually get a result saying it is or it isn't. And that's probably 40 or 50% of the inspections I do where there is vermiculite. I will do a test for the customer. We charge a small fee for it, but it's a great piece of money.
Yeah. So what about here? This one's probably a lot harder to find if you don't know what you're looking for, or you don't have the proper equipment to check for it. What about oil tanks?
Oil tanks, yeah, huge one. Now I put this under the safety category, and I'll explain why. They are a safety hazard, but not necessarily to the inhabitants of the home. So yeah, I think in past hangouts we've talked about oil tanks and sort of their effect on property. So just a short introduction. We got in the olden days we're going to heat our homes with heating oil, right? We're going to have an oil-fired furnace and boiler, and we're going to have either an above-ground oil tank or a buried oil tank. And the truck's going to come by and refill the oil, and that was before natural gas service came into the Lower Mainland, right? So in certain areas you see a lot of them. East Vancouver, there's quite a few on the North Shore. Very few in Richmond. You won't see it hardly at all. It's so marshy that you can't put an oil tank in the ground and just keep going and sinking. So in some areas it's not really a risk. And with these, what can happen is, as they get abandoned, maybe the owner of the house gets natural gas service and just kind of abandon it. And either they fill it with sand or cement in some cases, and they just kind of forget about it. It sits out in the yard. And if there's oil in the bottom of the tank that hasn't been used, and that thing rusts, all of a sudden you've got soil contamination. So that oil is leaching into the soil and water, groundwater, and it can actually be a huge problem. Let's say you decide to build a shed out back or a garage, and they're digging, and all of a sudden they find this oil tank. Well, hey, you know what? You just tested. You're going to test the soil and say, we've actually got contamination here. We need an environmental company to come and start cleaning up the soil and removing soil and replacing it. You can imagine that this gets extremely expensive. So with every home inspection, you should always have a qualified, like an actual professional, full-time oil tank removal company come and scan the property, and they will actually issue a certificate to you saying there is a tank or we don't think there's a tank here. And I recommend that almost every time you're buying a home past a certain date, especially in some high-risk areas. And so it's more of a financial safety than a safety for the home, but it can be an environmental problem as well.
All right, and the last one is on our list here is, what about pests? How can they be a safety issue?
Yeah, so pests, no surprise, we live in a rainforest, and we have a lot of, we've got raccoons, we've got squirrels, mice, rats, bees, ants. I could probably sit here all day and just name different animals that I found in houses, but from a safety standpoint, there's a couple different reasons that pests are really important to check for. If you were to go to maybe 100 houses, you would actually find in about maybe 20 to 30 houses, you'd find a good deal of maybe a mice infestation, or maybe raccoon activity, or ants. Sometimes you have carpenter ants. But the real safety concern is with the droppings and the disease. So if you go up to an attic or a crawl space and you've got maybe a big rat problem there, you've got, rats do eventually die, right? And the rat bodies stay there, and they rot, they smell bad, and they attract other vermin, right? And then you've got droppings, they'll urinate, and it'll actually sit in your insulation. So it can actually be a pretty big safety concern. And as we know, mice and rats, should never be in contact with people because they carry diseases, and it's also more just unpleasant. It's unclean, right? It's a hygiene thing. You don't want rats running around your attic. So this is the kind of thing we're always checking for. And there's a few different trademarks that we look for, especially with mice in attics, is that they'll actually carve little paths through the insulation. So you may go up to an attic and you see you've got a bunch of fiberglass, insulation up there, and little pathways. But there's no droppings. You don't see the droppings, but you see little pathways. And that's usually a pretty good sign that something's been running around up there, whether it's a chipmunk or a mouse or a rat. And we always recommend calling a qualified pest control company to check it out before you go ahead and move in, because you're moving your family into this house. You want to make sure it's safe.
So that's the kind of core safety issues in older homes, pretty much in North America, let alone Vancouver. Is there anything else you'd like to include or finish off with?
No, just I can't recommend it strongly enough is to hire somebody who has experience with older homes. Call. You get it inspected every time. If you're getting a great deal from your uncle, and and you're buying this house, it doesn't matter. You should always get a home inspection done by somebody who is familiar with these issues, because you can save a lot more than the inspection costs. If you spend $500 on a home inspection and you save $10,000 on fumigating the attic and removing asbestos somewhere, that's a pretty good return, right? So always hire a qualified home inspector. And the last thing I'll say is please give us a call for your next home inspection. My number's at the bottom of the screen.
So folks, we've been talking with David Fairbairn. He's a certified home inspector in Vancouver, and you can reach him. He deals with the whole Metro Vancouver area, from Coquitlam right to West Van, Richmond, Surrey, you name it, he goes there. So he's a good guy, and he knows his stuff. David Fairbairn at fairbairninspections.com. Give him a call, 604-395-2795. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Mark. Talk to you later.